bit of reorganisation. Well, we can always come back and ask questions at the end. So with that, I'm going to welcome Charlie Rapple to the stand. Charlie is Associate Director of TBI Communications, offering strategic consultancy and outsourced marketing implementations to publishers. Charlie has a long and illustrious career in scholarly publishing and working in and around scholarly publishing. Been involved with KBART. I don't know how many people know about KBART, but it's not unfortunately the subject we're going to go into today. So I should skip over that. Also, I noticed on your iPad there that you definitely are a fan of Citroën. Anyway, without further ado, Charlie's going to present her paper now.
I am, and I'm going to take quite a different direction to my colleagues up here on the panel, which I hope won't disappoint you all. I want to take a step back from the technology and the behaviours surrounding social media and identity and talk about the meaning of identity online in more than just I think there are implications in social media that we're only just starting to catch hold of for how, as publishers, we manage our brands. And I think what I'm going to try and do is explore that in a little more detail and hopefully give you a sense of where to start in terms of getting your brand fit for purpose in the social media age. So that's the lens I'm going to take on identity today. So I'm starting with the British Bulldog. A famous quote: "We shape our buildings, then they shape us." For me, it's we shape our technologies, and then they shape us. So that's my first point really this morning. Does anybody else find themselves thinking sometimes in Facebook updates and Twitter posts and kind of restructuring your thoughts into 140 characters? I do this quite regularly. And I know people who actually write talks like this with Twitter sound bites in mind. So I just thought I'd put the hashtag up in case you want to tweet any of mine. And I'm going to refer a few times today to a clinical psychologist. She's a professor at MIT called Sherry Turkle. You probably can't quite read that on the bottom right, but she's written this book called Alone Together. And the subtitle is Why We Expect More from Technology and Less from Each Other. And she talks about technology as the architect of our intimacies. And she even kind of couches it in addiction terms. She says we start with the illusion that technology will give us control, and we end up controlled, obsessed, if you like, with sort of checking our status, checking our email. You know, I'm sitting up here at the front and I can't quite get off Twitter. I have to kind of see what you were saying about them and what everybody else is saying about the other sessions. So we do kind of end up controlled by technology. And it changes our options and our expectations, I think, of ourselves and of each other. And I think that kind of started, so in going back to something Paul said earlier, we used to have quite disconnected identities online. So we had, or in the real world, in fact, so we would have groups of friends, groups of family. There might be a little bit of crossover. We'd have work colleagues in that mix. We might have people that we knew through evening classes, hobbies, and all these kind of pockets of our lives were relatively unconnected. Social media then has, I think, joined the dots between those different aspects of our lives. So if you think about how your Facebook account, when I set Facebook up, I set it up very specifically as a personal thing where I was going to connect with friends. And it has nonetheless morphed into being something where I'm very actually hooked up to people that I know through work, through the industry, which has its own challenges, as I'm sure you're all aware. So as the dots are joined between these different areas of our identities, our identity kind of comes to solidify before our eyes and before the eyes of everybody we know. And I think, therefore, it makes our identity less malleable, if you like. More of it is now visible. We can't just represent ourselves as we would like to be in each context because the people we're talking to have seen us in all those different contexts. So the question is, as our identity kind of takes shape, what shape does it have? And as we become more aware of the shape that it is taking, so I think we begin to become more conscious of that, and we begin to shape our online identities with more deliberation, from being a reflection of who we actually are in the real world. Online identities become a construction of who we want to be and who we want to be perceived to be. So my second point really is that identity is evolving, and there is now, I think, a divergence between who we actually are in the real world and who we present ourselves as being online. Now, those of you who have had the joy, I know it's on BBC America, those of you who've watched Top Gear, some of my UK friends here will know this. This is the cool wall from Top Gear. And in the programme on TV, they stick cars on the wall. So as Richard says, I have a very cool car that would be over there in the sub-cool category. But they this is how they decide what's cool. And I think that's a really interesting way, because there's no other way exactly of defining how well something is going to work. You can't look at the audience it's targeting or the methodology within it and say categorically how it just all comes down to whether people think it's cool. So I've kind of done a little guess ranking of different social media tools there. And I think the important point here is that this is all relevant to how we perceive people online. So even the context in which we meet or see colleagues online is relevant to our perception of them. So one example might be that, if somebody has a Gmail address, certainly, 5 years ago, if you had a Gmail address, you were super cool. If you're still using AOL online, not so much. So there's all these things informing our perception of people's identities, and it's not just things that they're directly shaping, it's also some of those kind of nuances in the background. And it's a very subjective picture, so I guess my point here is that, God, you cannot read that probably. So identity is affected by context. The medium is still the message, I think, and the channel choice influences how our identity is perceived.
So again, that has implications for us as publishers when we're choosing how to engage with social media. So the creation of this online identity is a serious business. It's a nuanced business, and it's a commonly held fallacy, I think, that today's teenagers don't think about their online identity and their behaviour online. They do. They just think about it differently to how we grown-ups think about it. So we're all worrying about privacy issues and whether we should engage in the social environment because of the privacy concerns. And they've kind of recognised that that privacy is effectively a lost cause online, and that's something you can tweet if you like, because the strength of the social obligation to be part of the network outweighs the concerns that we can realistically have about privacy. And again, there's a sort of echo for publishers here, not so much on the privacy point, but that the strength of the obligation to be there kind of needs to outweigh any of your reservations about being there. So teenagers aren't concerned about privacy and things like that, but they are very concerned about how they present themselves, who they want to be online, not where or whether they want to be online, but who they want to be online. This is my cipher of Brad. Brad is one of the teenagers who participated in Sherry Turkle's research that I referred to for the book Alone Together. And I'm going to read you just a small quote that she gives about Brad. She says, Brad says, only half-jokingly, that he worries about getting confused between what he composes for his online life and who he really is. He's not yet confirmed in his identity, and it makes him anxious to post things about himself that he doesn't really know are true. It burdens him that the things he says online affect how people treat him in the real world, which sort of echoes a point Paul was making earlier. People already relate to him based on things he has said on Facebook. He struggles to be more himself there, but this is hard. He says that even when he tries to be honest on Facebook, He cannot resist the temptation to make the right impression. So that's the next generation talking there. And I think the brand problem, the Brad problem is actually the brand problem. It affects all of us as individuals and as organisations as we try to communicate via social media. And I work with a lot of publishers who say that their staff want more guidance around how to express themselves when using social media for work. They're cautious about the responsibility of representing the company and being so exposed, and not having kind of rubber stamped responses and a process for everything that they might encounter out there in the kind of social Wild West. And I think this uncertainty stems from a lack of brand identity. And scholarly publishers, as we know, kind of haven't traditionally had to focus on brand and strategically work at brand. Journal brand has kind of been where it's at. That's what users engage with. That's what they're familiar with. That's what attracts submissions and subscriptions. So at the publisher level, we haven't really had to put the work in that you might have done in a consumer organisation. So the challenges that publishing staff are facing and the concerns that Brad has on the previous slide, they all come down to brand. It's about perceptions and how to influence those positively. It's about consistency of message and ensuring that you present a consistent image. And it's about conveying a human face to build relationships, to engender loyalty, to increase recognition, and to kind of counteract negativity as well. And I'm sorry that even in this day and age, this was the best clip art, I thought, for representing a scholarly publisher, a greying old man, so think on that. So brand becomes even more important as attention spans decrease. In the social media world, I was thinking as I put this slide together about chat roulette. I don't know how many of you here have come across chat roulette. It's kind of extreme social networking where you go to this website, you get randomly connected to somebody from anywhere else in the world who's online at that time, and you get 2 seconds. 2 seconds. And I think there's a horrible phrase. If you don't like neologisms, if you don't like verbing of nouns, when you're on this site, if the person doesn't like what they're saying, what you're saying, and they want to move on, they next you. So you get nexted. Horrible. But so you get 2 seconds typically to make an impression. And that's not a long time. You know, I've talked much longer than that already about what this concept is. So you need to be really clear what you want to convey in that tiny amount of time that is available to you. And everybody in the organisation needs to be clear on that, because everybody is going to have a part to play in creating that perception. And as publishers, our authors and readers are increasingly, as we know, time pressured. So they might not yet have got down to giving us only 2 seconds of their time, but that's sort of the direction we're heading in. I noticed Paul tweeted earlier about, what was your word, Paul, publication unit?
Minimum viable publication.
Minimum viable publication, you know. If people are going to get to the point where they only give us 2 seconds of our time, how are we going to publish for that? So we're kind of, I've added another picture here of a book, because I think we're back in the world of moments of truth. There's another great Jan Carlsen, a book that if you haven't read it, I would highly recommend. And it's all about the fact that our corporate relationships actually come down to these series of small interactions with lots of different people from all around our organisation. So every one of them needs a clear sense of who we are, what we represent, in order to create and to reinforce this consistent identity for the organisation. So that's my 5th point, if I'm still counting. So for social media to work, you need a brand idea. So this is my heart. At the heart of consistent identity is a brand idea. And one of the publishers I've worked with has a lovely way of explaining this to her team. She says the brand idea is about saving time explaining who we are in order to spend that time capitalizing on who we are. I think that really has it in a nutshell for me. It's as much about the heart as it is about the head. And that's because you're building a relationship with customers. It's not just about pushing through a transaction. And that's obviously a point that you will hear time and again in social media terms. It's not ultimately a transactional environment. It's about relationships. And the brand idea needs to be something that not only makes you recognizable and memorable externally, but it should also be something that gives your internal staff some motivation, gives them a boost, really something that they can cleave to. And so to be credible externally and to be something that people internally will buy into, your brand idea needs to be a reflection of your current culture and the strengths that you as an organisation have. So it's no good sort of setting up your brand idea as something you aspire to being, but that right now you're nowhere near being. It's got to be credible, and it's got to reflect the existing realities of your organisation. It's not necessarily part of your external messaging at all. I think it's important not to confuse a brand idea with a strapline. The right idea is for motivating staff, and it kind of gives them a framework in which to make their own decisions about how to express themselves. So it's not saying, put this on the end of every email and that will enable the world to understand who we are. It's about giving them a context in which to understand how to write the rest of that email and how to embody your brand all the time in everything they do, not just in their signature block. So here are some brand ideas that you will be more or less familiar with. As I say, they're not typically something external, but in some cases they have become quite widely known. So you'll never see an official Google document or site or whatever with "Don't be evil" written on it, but we all know that's their brand idea, and it kind of comes back to bite them sometimes, the fact that that's become publicly known. But even so, I think it is a very successful brand idea because it absolutely conveys what the founders of that organisation feel that their staff should embody in the character of that organisation. So it's kind of, this is how we want you to be, and we're expressing that through the way that we describe it. So I think it's a well-known and successful brand idea, and some of those others you may agree more or less with how well they achieve those brand ideas, but that's what's behind what they're trying to be. So what about publishers? For those of you at the back, I've just put on some big publisher brands at the bottom here. What's the brand idea between some of these big publishers? I think that's an interesting exercise for us to try and understand what we think is driving and how these publishers want their staff to embody the ideals. When you have a strong brand idea, you kind of take it forward by then exploring the impact it would have on your strategy, on your products, on your communications, and on your culture. And if it's come from your existing strengths, the impact it has is to sort of unify all the different aspects of the organisation, all the different functions within the business in pursuit of a sort of common identity and a common goal. And as I said, if it's a sort of natural extension of an existing culture, then it's much easier for that process to happen and for everybody around the organisation to begin embodying it. And Paul talked a little bit about social media as a way of giving your staff a voice. And I think that comes together really neatly in this idea of the brand idea. Not only does it help give your staff a voice and help them shape their voice in social media, but actually the very development of the idea should also reflect them and give them a voice in that sense. But even so, as we know, even when you've got this whole kind of framework in place, people who haven't traditionally had kind of outward-facing roles continue to be quite wary of what social media means for them and how they have to engage. I think basically my view here is that people expect rules, so give them some. A defined framework gives people then, as I say, that confidence to kind of go forward, make their own judgments, make their own mistakes, and gives them a sense of knowing the boundaries in which they're doing that. I guarantee this is the weirdest slide you'll see all conference, but I'm going to slowly explain to you what that image means. So for me, there's kind of 4 aspects to a framework for social media and to a kind of rules for social media. It's about community and how you engage with them. So that's the people in the background. They're the community. We need to listen to them. We need to respond to them. We need to ask them things and make the most of having a relationship with them. And we do need to share with them, but that, I think, very importantly, is the 4th thing rather than the first thing that we turn to social media for. So don't turn to social media just as another PR channel. Make sure that you're listening, asking, responding, as well as sharing. I think that the key advantage of that approach is that it gives you the time to build up an understanding of what's appropriate before you launch in with your own communications. The second kind of key tenet is responsibility. Remember that social media is a very public environment. I would encourage everyone to be very open, to be transparent. Those have been real watchwords for the conference, and never more so than in social media. But recognise that it's a window onto the organisational soul, effectively. So, you know, opening the door to social media is putting a window onto who you are as an organisation. So while you want to be transparent, you want to convey good things, make sure that you're also being careful around kind of proprietary information. And then finally, it's about judgment. So it's about, as I say, getting to know the audience, considering what's appropriate for them. That can be in terms of tone of voice. That can be in terms of the types of content you post, the frequency with which you post. Getting that balance right is really critical, and that does require a level of judgment. And finally, don't feed the trolls, which is what's happening in the foreground there. And if that is a meaningless term to you, then it's basically don't fight fire with fire. If people start dissing your brand and picking holes in everything you say, don't go back by picking holes back in them like you would in the playground. Just walk away, try and take it offline, just dignify it with a polite, short response, ask them, you know, to get in touch with you. You'll be happy to discuss it further, but don't, in that open environment, engage, because it will never end, I can tell you. So finally, a few more minutes. The brand idea can also, I think, help to mitigate some of the kind of classic challenges that we're facing in social media. And one is this sense of identity capital. And I was really pleased to find an image that so beautifully encapsulates the term identity capital. People in an organisation feel very strongly about the kind of personal aspects of the individual brand, I suppose. And so there's always a real tension between being asked to post on behalf of the organisation using maybe an organisational handle, but also wanting to kind of have all the very smart and interesting things they're saying, building up their own personal brand at the same time. So that creates a bit of a tension with people sometimes unclear about how and when to be which of their personas. And I think actually if you've got a clear brand idea, you don't necessarily need everyone to be posting as your brand name, because they can go away and embody the brand idea and build up the organisational brand as individuals, because as individuals they're all in pursuit of the same common identity and common goals. So once you've expressed what that common identity and goal is, they can work towards it much more effectively, and therefore you don't need them to be doing that on the institution's account. This is kind of a joke, really, but another area where brand idea can help is the challenge of relationships. Technology makes it much easier to communicate with people, and I think therefore sort of leads us to undervalue relationships. And we've kind of seen with the chat roulette example of how the next generation of users really don't value relationships and have this much lower sense of loyalty. And this is happening in publishing too, where a lot of the time we're finding ourselves being, I suppose, replaced by younger, sexier models, really, with new journals coming in, with your Peer J or whatever. Our authors and readers are kind of casting around for more interesting bedmates, if you like. So we sort of joke about second life divorces, but I think that there is a serious undercurrent to this, which is that we need to take much more care around our relationships in the online environment, and we need to invest in them. And so you'll see a lot of publishers now focused on relationship marketing, advocacy strategies, actually sort of formalizing their approach to the networks and how they nurture those networks and how they therefore gain access to networks beyond the ones they currently have. That's our future, I think. It's all about nurturing a community of readers around our content. So we really need to ensure that we value relationships. And to do that, to build relationships effectively, again, you need to have a strong brand that people are building that relationship with. So finally, there's this challenge around the democratization of identity in the social media space, and this sense that going online, going into social media loses control of the brand. And a lot of publishers are quite nervous, I think, about sort of sticking their heads above the parapet of social media. I mean, it's not like putting on the one true ring. You know, when you set up your Twitter account, Sauron's eye doesn't turn to you, flames of wrath come at you. So I think the first thing I say to publishers who express that concern is kind of get over it. Like, you know, you're not the only publisher in social media, and you're not suddenly going to be shot down in flames the minute you appear there. But also it's just around making sure that you have got process and protocol in place. As I say, staff feel much more comfortable when they've got a framework in which to function. So, you know, if there is a concern that you might get some kind of unwelcome feedback socially and publicly, then make sure that you have a program in place for monitoring that and for actioning on it, and you know who's responsible, when, and, you know, just have people on watch effectively. So yeah, Richard talked right back at the beginning about the big transition that consumer brands have made into the social environment. I think the real advantage of that is that you can have different identities that fit with different platforms. So whereas on your own website, that's one place, one identity, one persona that you can convey. When you go out into the social environment and kind of distribute your online presence, you can kind of, to an extent, be all things to all people a little more. But make sure that you're doing that in a way that is consistent, that is aligned with a central identity, and make sure that there is trust there and that you're out there to build relationships and that you're willing to sort of put some control into the hands of those audiences. It's a bit like that awful kind of team building exercise where you have to fall backwards into the arms of a colleague. Social media is a bit like that. You have to have some trust in your network, and you have to cede some control to them. So we live in an age that is shaped by technology. On some levels, we fear that it will betray us, hence the army there. But overcoming this fear requires us to be sure about who we are and what we stand for. And it's about context, it's about culture, and it's about community. And for me, at the heart of those three things, and that's me done.
Thank you, Gordon. And at that point, I'm going to open that up to questions from the floor, and you can see people charging towards the microphone. So in the manner that I started before, whilst you're thinking of a question, I'm going to open out a question, because I think that there's something really important about what you were saying there, which is the kind of, in a way, the missing link between one end of that spectrum that I was talking about and the other, in the sense that it's very easy, I think, to sort of make a mistake with social engagement, in that it's just creating a forum for discussion around content or around the published materials. And I think you've widened that view out quite considerably, which is absolutely the right approach. And talking about social media being the forum for engagement, the total forum for engagement with the rest of the world for a particular brand. I mean, that idea of social media being engagement, could you elaborate on that for a moment?
Thanks. That's a nice, easy question to take in 1 minute. Yeah, I mean, I think actually it's a subset of engagement, and too often we look at it from the perspective of, this is social media, we've got to do something with it, rather than what role does it have in our existing strategies, and how does it serve things that we're trying to do elsewhere? So I think it is very important to put it in the context of some kind of engagement strategy with clear goals, because we haven't even talked about measurement of social media today, and I know we've got some experts in the room on that topic, and I think you can only realistically measure something if you know what you were trying to achieve with it in the first place. So I think engagement and building relationships with our readers has to be in the context of a strategy for us as an organisation. And for me, publishing is less and less about the content. Actually, ultimately, we don't even create that content. It's about the services that we put around that content. Selling services becomes about selling relationships because they're much more kind of commoditized. So I think the engagement aspect is critical to our future as publishers, and social media is one way of creating engagement. And it's kind of, I mean, we've talked a little bit about explicit and implicit and visible and invisible, and so social media is one very visible way of having relationships and serving those relationships, but it needs to be as part of a more embedded engagement strategy. Did that actually answer the question that you asked? That's another point I wanted to make.
No, I mean that's fine. And a last question then, if there are no other questions from the floor, because I think that this is, probably one that is pertinent in our scholarly community. There's a lot of, we all I think would acknowledge that there's a lot of conservatism in scholarly publishing. And this idea that there's a kind of a massive contrast, I think, between one of your earlier slides where you were talking about privacy being a lost cause, effectively, and which is effectively the kind of ultra social, embrace everything, throw down all barriers to visibility. That is definitely jarring, I think, for the sort of inherent kind of conservatism in scholarly publishing. I mean, how do you think that those things come to clash together?
Well, I think the point is we don't have to think that privacy is a lost cause, but we have to know and accept that our users or our upcoming generation of users think that privacy is a lost cause. And that's true of a lot of things that are the next generation of customers that we're going to serve have very different perceptions about, what they can do with content, sharing, things like that. And one response is to kind of fight against that. I think there's no point. I think that's a waste of energy. I think actually acknowledging that that is the case, not necessarily embracing it and going down that road ourselves, but recognizing that that's the paradigm of this next generation. And so we need to ensure that the services that we build acknowledge that and reflect that. So, for example, on a quite simplistic level, if users aren't that hung up on privacy in the next generation, then we don't need to invest lots of time and energy in services that focus on their privacy. That's not where their attention is. So we can still be concerned about our privacy, but we don't need to go the whole hog in focusing on that for them, because that's not what they're interested in.
Okay, and any other questions from the floor? Okay, please come to the mic.
Hi, thanks for the fantastic presentations. They were really informative. I think it's just coming back to, again, the same question, the conservatism in the scholarly community. And as I talk to, let's say, scientists or researchers and say, there are all these exciting tools that we can develop, help you collaborate, things like that. And they say, we don't have time. Social networks, they're for those people. We don't have time to update statuses, and we don't need to. We can just Skype and talk to people if we need to, things like that. So if someone, let's say, comes in, invests the time and resource to build these kind of things, I guess my question is, where's the uptake in the scholarly community for these kind of tools that bring in these social networking interactions? The Mendeley, great success, but we can't all be maybe the next Mendeley. So how do you think that adoption rate is going to come along? Is it going to be in the next decades as the new Facebook generation comes along, or is it going to be in the next few years?
I think the key is that we have to do our research, so we can't just look at existing platforms that are out there and try and replicate existing functionality and assume that that is then going to attract people in. We have to look at a sort of triumvirate of, and I think this is true for social media and for mobile equally, that there's users and their workflows at the top of the pyramid, there's our content and services, and there is, in this case, social and the behaviours that lends itself to. And it's finding what is between those three things that actually adds value. So sure, yeah, you can't just build it and they will come anymore. They're in enough places already. They've got enough going on already. So it's looking at what are the pain points in the current processes. Sorry, every time I do a plosive, the whole room booms. So it's what are, you know, if the problem is that they don't have time, what exactly do they not have time for? What is taking up the time? How can we help them save time in other ways? And are there services that we can fit around that precise problem? So it's kind of acknowledging where the problems are and focusing on solving those. Which we've heard a lot about throughout the whole conference so far. We're not now content providers. We're solution providers, and it's making sure that we understand the workflows and the pain points of our audiences. And there is then a little bit of alchemy in the middle. You know, not every idea that any of us have is ever going to make it. So we can research and understand those pain points and workflows. We can develop something that seems like it would be an excellent solution to a problem in the system that for whatever reason, and they can be more or less obvious, doesn't catch on, and then something else that somebody else is doing will catch on. And I guess the final point there is also choose your markets wisely, because some will be more or less receptive to services in these areas. So absolutely don't be trying to target an audience that's never really done anything social and digital with a sudden brand new socially oriented tool.
If I could just add to that a little bit. So that's the sort of time argument goes along with some of the implicit versus explicit social actions. So when you ask people, do you want to write status updates? They say, no, that's a lot of work. If it's sort of, would you like to see what your colleagues are working on and see what they're doing? It's like, yes. So, if you can get them to the point of at least joining the network and at least, forming some connection point, there's often algorithms and other things that can be used in that system, and some of the Mendeley suggestions are a good example of that. That can pull in related things to them. Like it's some very large proportion of people, I don't remember the exact statistic, that join Twitter and never ever post, right? But they're using it to see all these status updates. They can then use Twitter to log into a tool like Prismatic, which takes all the links in your Twitter feed and says, here's your personal news thing based on what your friends are reading. So you can get a lot of value from those secondary network effects and from those implicit actions if you just get them in the first place. So if we can make that process easy, they'll start to see what the value is, and then they'll see, hey, if I add 3 documents, I get more recommendations, and there's that. Some of the future things to look at are gamification. Right? There are great things to do there where it doesn't feel like work, but they get a lot of value from it.
Cool. Thanks.
Okay, and any final question for the panel before we wrap up? Okay, well, thank you again. Put your hands together for the panel.